Hi, and thank you so much for popping by. My name is Dr. Rita Pobaluzi, and you are most welcome to this conversation today. So, this story of decarbonizing economies, decarbonizing nations, decarbonizing businesses is really coming up in news coverage, not only in Botswana, but within the African context as well. Now, this idea of decarbonizing economies, decarbonizing nations and businesses is actually considered to be a good idea when it comes to reducing the impact, the negative impact of greenhouse emissions into the air. And behind this drive for decarbonization is the intention to expand some revenue streams through this idea of making the environment cleaner, right? So the carbon tax or the environmental taxes are then going to be used as money or funds that will also help to mitigate and reduce the influence of greenhouse emissions, right? So it feels like a social responsibility cause as well. So that's why it has a very positive aspect to it. But the more you read about decarbonization, the more you realize that, you know what, there is some sense of inequality in the story. To reinforce this point, I'm going to use the example of South Africa and Ghana. So in the case of South Africa, the carbon tax, according to research, is a legitimate idea. It's legitimate in the sense of South Africa has a population of almost 63 to 64 million people, and South Africa is the world's 14th largest emitter of greenhouse gases, right? And in the African region, South Africa is the largest country that emits greenhouse gases. And in terms of electricity grid, South Africa is the world's most carbon intensive. So they consume a lot of electricity, and they're actually ranked 17th globally. And that's relative to the South African population, right? But if you look at the case of Botswana, Botswana is only 2.3 million people. How do we justify carbon tax in a country of 2.3 million people and a country that has such high inequality? And by the way, South Africa also has very high margins of inequality. And that is why when you look at the concept of carbon tax, you will find this conversation of inequality. And I'll explain this a little bit further. So outside of South Africa, which has had this carbon tax since 2019, there's also Ghana, which since 2024, they have introduced some form of vehicle carbon taxes, right? And although this is obviously a positive initiative in the sense of mitigating environmental impacts, the environmental activists are saying, but Ghana, you do not fall into the countries that can justify having a carbon tax because you are not contributing negatively to climate change. So environmentalists are saying it's a little bit unfair for a country like Ghana to introduce this vehicle carbon tax because they are nowhere near having such an influence on climate change as per South Africa and as per the industrialized nations, right? And in fact, the environmentalists, according to this research, are saying it's because Ghana has no choice. And we're going to talk about this lack of choice when it comes to decarbonization and countries in the Sub-Saharan African region. So to a lesser degree, other countries in the African region, such as Malawi, Mauritius, Rwanda, Uganda, Zambia, South Africa, and Ethiopia, have also introduced some form of a vehicle emission tax, or these greenhouse emission taxes, or these environmental taxes. Now, again, the more you read the story, the more you realize why these countries that have traditionally been known as a low greenhouse emission places or destinations are now pushing for this environmental taxes and specifically the carbon taxes. So according to research, the pressure to decarbonize for countries that are in low income regions or low to lower middle income countries, particularly those in Sub-Saharan Africa, the pressure to decarbonize is actually coming from the idea of complying for funding from international financial institutions, multilateral development banks, and international donors, etc. So that is where the pressure is really coming from. So this is why when I was reading this research a little bit more, it came to this idea that, oh, so the push to decarbonize is actually in order for countries to comply to receive more funding, more finances, more development funds from these international donors and these development banks globally. So that's where the pressure is coming from, right? Carbon tax must be a very targeted initiative. It mustn't be an all-inclusive initiative because not all people are justified to pay carbon tax, and not all people, specifically in poor regions such as Sub-Saharan Africa, should be bearing the cost of climate change on that individual level, right? A region such as Sub-Saharan Africa, it is characterized by poverty. It is characterized by low-income groups. It is characterized by people who, even if they are in the upper echelons of society, they can hardly be compared to those better off in the industrialized world. So the emphasis here is that even those who have the means in the Sub-Saharan Africa are nowhere comparable to those who have the means in the industrialized world. And that in the case of Sub-Saharan Africa, the low-income group is the largest, right? There is so much poverty, there is so much inequality, even in the case of South Africa, even in the case of Ghana, which has the vehicle carbon tax. These are countries that have high margins of inequality. So it doesn't make sense to apply carbon tax to the national population, right? It doesn't make sense to apply carbon tax in Sub-Saharan Africa to the national population, but it makes more sense to apply carbon tax to the businesses that contribute to climate change, right? And this is why I've stated before in a previous clip that, mining companies in Botswana have said, you know what, we as mining companies that are engaging in the nature of business that contributes to climate change, we are going to take on decarbonization as a social responsibility cause because we are aware and we recognize the role that we play when it comes to environmental emissions or greenhouse emissions. As I'm saying, there is absolutely nothing wrong with implementing any initiatives that will reduce these greenhouse emissions and make the world a healthier and cleaner place. However, for countries that are in the low income status or the lower middle income status, or for countries with a very minimal population such as Botswana, it doesn't seem justified to have a carbon tax because, according to research, this carbon tax disproportionately affects and impacts poor households. It increases the cost of doing business, and particularly when the country has a very small population relative to the influence and the contribution they have to climate change, right? So any high carbon tax will hurt attempts of the poor to integrate into labor markets and trade, for example, by rendering the movement of people and goods more expensive. So there are both negatives and positives when it comes to carbon tax, right? And particularly as we look at the Sub-Saharan African region. Now, one of the negatives, and this is according to research and according to the case of South Africa's decarbonization policies, is that the decarbonization tax or the policy itself is criticized because there's a lack of transparency. There is a lack of transparency about this collection of this carbon tax and what exactly it's being used for, right? So people are already decrying the idea of this carbon tax that's been collected because they don't know where this carbon tax is going to be used, and if indeed it will be used to mitigate things like deforestation or greenhouse emissions. Another negative is that these environmental taxes are seen as going to be negatively affecting Sub-Saharan Africa's development, right? That they're going to slow down or hinder industrial development and poverty reduction, right? So instead of money going to poverty reduction, money is now going to be used, potentially misused, because they are already worried about the lack of transparency in this particular carbon tax. And then another negative that is clearly coming up from multiple sources is that carbon tax itself is likely to increase the cost of living overall. And I say this because it was also mentioned in the Ghana instance that carbon tax is disproportionately impacting poor households, and it is also increasing the cost of doing business, right? And relative to the population sizes and relative to the nation's contribution to climate change. Now, some of the positives of carbon tax in the Sub-Saharan African region is that it has the potential to widen the tax base, right? So, for example, there are areas where some businesses have been untaxed. For example, the informal sectors, right? So some of these informal sectors that are engaged in businesses that are of the nature that contributes to climate change, these are businesses that legitimately would need to be taxed for carbon tax, right? So that can definitely work. If used correctly, this carbon tax would therefore boost sectors such as health, environment, and education, right? And this carbon tax is also seen as something that has a potential to contribute to the sustainable development goals, right? So such as poverty reduction, environmental impact reductions. So all of this tax, if used appropriately, if this tax will not be used for corrupt incentives, then it can definitely be a form of giving back to the community through these taxes. Essentially, all this research, all this news coverage is showing that one of the major positives of the carbon tax, or decarbonizing economies and decarbonizing businesses and decarbonizing nations, is that these carbon credits, or the taxes that are going to come from these environmental taxes, can be used to develop regions such as Sub-Saharan Africa, right? They can be used to develop sectors such as health. They can be used for poverty reduction. They can be used for environmental issues. And of course, these are taxes that can be used for the education purposes. Alrighty, my friend, that's really what I wanted to say about all of this decarbonization and how it should not be applying to the general population, how decarbonization should be a targeted initiatives to specific nations, specific businesses, and not to the general population. Alrighty then, my friend, I hope you are having a lovely day where you are, but most importantly, I hope you're having a healthy day wherever you're watching me from. Bye.